Hi, and welcome back to Psychology 2. Do you remember learning to tie your shoelaces? Do you remember laboring over the laces, your fingers fumbling over what you were hoping would somehow turn into a bow? Remember the frustration, the knot, and finally giving your shoe to an adult? Now imagine you had to learn to tie your own shoelaces with your left hand and someone else would use their right hand to do the same job on your shoe. Imagine typing an email but relying on someone else's hand to control the other half of the keyboard. Imagine learning to walk and trying to run with your left leg and someone else's right leg. Not for Abigail and Brittany Hensel. Now at 31 years old, the Hensel twins are one of only 3 or 4 documented cases of dicephalic twins. Twins who have 2 heads but share, twins who have 2 heads but share 2 arms, 2-legged body. They share most of their organs from the waist down, including reproductive organs, a bladder, but each have their own stomach, heart, and brain. It's a marvelous example of the human body's capacity to adapt. The 2 girls are able to coordinate movements, to clap, to run, to drive a car, ride a bicycle, type emails, even though each of their brains thinks independently and controls separate sides of the body that they share. Doctors can't easily explain how 2 separate brains can work in such perfect synchronicity to allow them to complete complicated movements without the girls conferring with each other. In most other ways, the girls have developed just as others do. They have separate personalities, different tastes. While Brittany is spunky and likes milk for breakfast and wants to be a pilot, at school, they take tests individually, they get different grades, they both want to and are now married. Abby and Brittany's coordination, as well as their unique qualities, are of interest to psychologists who often explore the question of biological and environmental differences as we developed into who we are. As identical twins, Abby and Brittany have identical genes and as dicephalic twins, they also have identical environments. Abby and Brittany throw a curve at us when we consider cognition, especially and specifically language and intelligence generally. So in terms of their cognition, 2 brains managing one body is the challenge there. Language and intelligence, well, that's kind of typical in terms of individuals. So in part 1, we're going to be looking at thinking. It's also, when you think thinking, it's also known as cognition. Thinking may be defined as paying attention to information, representing it mentally, reasoning about it, and making judgments and decisions about it. Thinking is conscious, planned attempts to make sense of the world. So even though we use the word thinking, in many circumstances, do we really know the mechanics of thinking? There are 2 primary tools we need in order to think, and we use our cognition skills. They are imagery and concepts, and we're going to break those down individually. Imagery and concepts are mental categories that we use to group things together. Objects, relations, events, abstractions, qualities that have common properties. Imagery is the representation in the mind of a sensory experience. Whether it's, we think in terms of, in our mind, visual, auditory, gustatory, motor, olfactory, and tactile, the senses. When we think about past events or try to consider the future, it is imagery that we apply to get this sort of a visual representation of the experience or the idea or the thought. We can move these images around in our mind. This is to better to better understand, to manipulate for creativity, or to organize, to use, to remember, and retrieve at a later time. Now we can describe what we imagined in our mind. Imagery first. Now concepts, these are labels that represent the classes or groups of objects, people, or events sharing common characteristics or attributes. Now we can form a concept in just a few steps. So first, from a formal definition of a concept, like a definition of a concept, we would approach the concept formation in an active, orderly, systematic, and not haphazard way. And then secondly, by systematically memorizing features or attributes common to members of a concept, as in a formal classification system. Now you can think studying of biology, anatomy and physiology, chemistry, or psychology. All of these involve learning new concepts by actively and in an orderly, systematic manner be able to understand complex systems, ideas, and subjects. And then thirdly, it's through our experience with positive and negative instances of the concept. Throughout our lives, we have been exposed to all sorts of concepts and have received all sorts of feedback from our parents, our friends, teachers, employers about our accuracy. Positive and negative, yes, that fits, or no, it doesn't, or it is, but with an exception, like, a penguin as a typical bird. That's an exception, because we might say a typical bird, our exemplar, is that of a flying bird, for one, and penguins don't fly. Now, a positive instance, for example, dogs are the best example of dog concept. Negative instances, things that are not dogs. And then fourth, it's through the use of prototypes. Prototypes are examples that embody the most common and typical feature of a particular concept. So for example, the bird prototype, as I mentioned, involves a robin or a sparrow, since they can fly, and rather than the penguin and emus, which don't fly. Now, do you have any prototypes for other things? A prototype for a car, fish, trees, rocks, mountains, lakes, ponds versus an ocean. It's through the use of exemplars, the individual instances or examples of a concept that are stored in memory for our personal experience. So if we take that a little further and say, well, what if you work in a zoo and specifically work with penguins? So that penguin might in fact become a part of your exemplar. So someone who does not work in a zoo may use the bird they see more regularly, the robin or the sparrow, as the exemplar of what is a bird. Exemplars are not static. My concept of a dog when I was 6 may not be the same concept of a dog now that I'm over 60. Exemplars are not static. They are dynamic, and as we can and do update our exemplars, we gain new concepts or examples. Now, the term overextension is an over-inclusion of instances in a category. So, for example, and you see this a lot with children as they learn the concepts, when a child is referring to horses as dogs. Some similar characteristics, they have foreleg and fur, however, we clearly know that a horse is not a dog. Let's touch on problem solving, because we use our thinking, our cognition, for problem solving. Approaches to problem solving, well, first, we need to understand the problem, and then we'll look at 3 features to this first step about understanding the problem. First, we're going to look at the parts of our mental representation on the problem as it relates to one another in a meaningful way. So first we need to get a handle on what is the problem. So what are the issues that we need to be keep in our mind, as it were. Secondly, the elements or the parts of our mental representation of the problem correspond to the elements of the problem in the outer world. And then 3, We have a storehouse of background knowledge that we can apply to the problem. Problem solving, by definition, does not include or even suggest that we make good or beneficial decisions, just that we choose from alternatives. Now, this can and is very individual experience. My alternatives to a problem that we are trying to solve may not be the same as yours. There are many things that we can and do affect our decision making. And we're going to look at a few of these. We often use a strategy known as elimination by aspect. Now, this is where we eliminate alternatives that do not meet our criteria for a good decision. When you chose Georgian College, you may have considered location, cost, program, support, availability to services or activities of interest, proximity to family. Given the choices or alternatives available, and eliminating those alternatives that didn't fit your expectations and desires. We also use math, sort of. We do use what are known as algorithms in our decision making, which are step-by-step procedures that guarantees a solution, such as a mathematical formula or a systematic exploration of every possible solution. We could be using algorithms to decide what to have for dinner, what are used in very complex and data-heavy circumstances where a precise answer is required. Now, doing a Google search for something specific, a topic, Google uses algorithms to personalize your results. This way, everyone gets different results from their Google search. Systemic random search algorithms are every possible combination is examined. Now, there's another term that we use that is still within our decision making and problem solving, and that is what is known as heuristics. So those are heuristics. So we use heuristics. These are rules of thumb. If you wondered what that means, that is derived from the experiences and used in decision making and problem solving, even though there is no guarantee of their accuracy or usefulness. Heuristics permit more rapid solutions. There are many different heuristics. I'm just going to offer two of them that are in your textbook. Means and ends analysis. Here is what you're doing is you're assessing the difference between our current situation and our goals, and then do what we can to reduce this discrepancy. So we move closer and closer to our goals. It doesn't necessarily guarantee success. However, it does move us in the direction. And then secondly, an analogy. This is a partial similarity among things that are different in other ways. An analogy heuristic applies the solution of an earlier problem to the solution of a new one. So using your past experience with problems to assist in solving new ones. And that's an important strategy that we can use, particularly if we have past experiences that are related. So, what factors can affect problem solving? So let's consider three kind of factors that can affect the way we problem solve. And the first one makes good sense. Level of experience. Your level of expertise. The second is whether you fall prey to mental sets, and we'll look at that too. And then the third is whether you develop insight into the problem. So let's look at them individually. Levels of expertise. Experts solve problems more efficiently and rapidly than novices do. And that makes good sense. Experts have characteristics that include they know the particular area really well, they have a very good memory for the elements of the problem, and they form mental images or representations that facilitate problem solving. They relate the problem to similar problems. They have an efficient method for problem solving. And there's two such methods. There's one that's called parallel processing. Here you're dealing with simultaneously with two or more elements of the problem. Experts tend to do this. It's partly they have a bigger capacity and understanding of the parts. The second processing is what's known as serial processing. And here what we're doing is we handle one element of the problem at a time. This is what novices tend to do when problem solving, is one at a time, or serial processing. Then the second element around expertise is, after expertise, the second element is whether you fall prey to mental sets. So what is a mental set? Mental sets, these are the tendency to apply familiar problem-solving strategies before carefully considering the special requirements of the problem. A type of fixation in which an individual tries to solve the problem in a particular way that has worked in the past. So for example, resistance to paying bills online may result in a mental set. Perhaps you're an older person and you've always paid your bills by writing checks. And doing it online doesn't seem right. So writing checks, this is the way that we've always done it. Therefore, this is the way we should continue doing it, and it may not be a better solution. And then the third part, whether you develop insight into the problem. Now, insight, it seems as if pieces of information in the problem have suddenly been reorganized so that the solution can leap out at you. And that's what insight is. It's sort of like an inspiration of a solution after having looked at some of the parts. Sometimes insight provides you with a possible solution. Now, there's a related term that we'll touch on. It's called incubation. And incubation is about standing back from the problem, may allow you for this insight. It helps by distancing us from the unprofitable but persistent mental sets. So sometimes when you're working on a problem for class, it's better to step away from the work for a moment, come back and look at it. It may give you insights that you didn't otherwise see because you were just too close to the problem. Now, one element in thinking that's really important is what's known as functional fixedness. Now, this can hinder problem solving, by which is the failure to use familiar objects in a novel way to solve a problem. Now, pretend you're making coffee and you go into your kitchen and you don't have a regular carafe, it broke, to catch the coffee that you want to have. So why couldn't you use a bowl or a cup? A mental set or functional fixedness is if you can't think of another idea. I don't have those mixers, you use for mixing cake dough and stuff like that, those little prongs. If I don't have them, then I can't do it. But if I put a pair of scissors, point up and tie them in, then I have the two little owie things that I can do that with. Functional fixedness reduces the likelihood you can see those things. Now we can touch on judgment and decision making. People make most of the decisions on the basis of limited information. All the more reason to gather research. They take shortcuts. And now we all know, we will now look at some factors that can affect our judgment and decision making. And now we've touched on one, heuristics in decision making. And then we're going to look at a couple of other heuristics that explain this. Representative heuristics. Here, the strategy is to consider how closely a new object or situation is judged to resemble or match an existing prototype we have of the object or situation. So, for example, suppose you go to buy or adopt a puppy, and you have determined what breed of dog you want. Now, you remember that you really enjoyed and had a great fun with the Cocker Spaniel and you and your family had as a child. So it is the representative heuristic that is used if you choose to buy a Cocker Spaniel, believing you will enjoy it as much as you did with the one that you had when you were a child. Another heuristic is called availability heuristic, and it's based on whatever alternatives that just came to mind the easiest. Planning to go to a hockey game and you remember that the last time you went, you were late because of traffic. So you might decide to take a different route than the last time, even if you don't check to see if the traffic report indicates there's any traffic to avoid. Anchoring and adjustment heuristic. Anchoring is an overestimation of the importance of a factor by focusing on it to the exclusion of other relevant factors. It's kind of like focusing on the minimum credit card balance, which leads to higher interest rates. We have an initial view or presumption that is the anchor, and any additional information that is gained, we may adjust, but we may adjust grudgingly. So let's touch on another one. It's called the framing effect. And this is one way to sort of see old information in a new way. The framing effect refers to the way in which wording or the context in which information is presented can influence our decision making. Framing a decision to attend post-secondary education may be positive framing. It will set me up for my career choice. I can meet new friends, be able to have a career rather than a job to support me later. Or negative framing, where what is considered is the cost of education, moving away from family and friends, being, too much change. It'll be stressful and overwhelming. Either way, it is post-secondary, and our point of view on it, the good and the bad. Framing is similar to positive or negative points of view towards a choice. You can go either way or consider both sides. Now, what can happen in some of our problem solving is overconfidence. Overconfidence applies to judgments. Many people, even in the face of statistical evidence that showed them to be flawed, 2020 hindsight, we knew it all along. There were several reasons for overconfidence. One is that we tend to be unaware of how flimsy our assumptions can be. We tend to focus on examples that confirm our judgments and ignore those that do not. And because of our working memories have limited space, we tend to forget information that runs counter to our judgments. We work to bring about events we believe in so they can sometimes be self-fulfilling prophecies. Now, what we will complete that will complete our first concept, thinking. We'll now move into intelligence. We're going to touch briefly here on intelligence, the concept of intelligence. Intelligence is closely related to thinking, underlying ability to understand the world and to cope with its challenges. By definition, intelligence is the abilities, an individual's ability to understand complex ideas, to adapt effectively to the environment, and to learn from experience, to engage in various forms of reasoning, and to overcome obstacles by taking thought. So let's look at some of the theories of intelligence. And we'll start with the introduction of exploration into intelligence and what's called the factor theories. Factor theories argue that intelligence is made up of a number of mental abilities ranging from 1 to 100. Charles Spearman, he suggested that intelligence has an underlying factor called G for general intelligence. And G is a broad reasoning and problem-solving skills. Now, some people have relatively superior in some areas, and that would be an S factor for specific abilities. Spearman used factor analysis as a statistical technique to test his views. Spearman's influence is seen in the intelligence tests such as the Stanford Binet that yields 1 IQ score to indicate the level of general intelligence. Following Spearman, Louis Thurstone, he used factor analysis and suggested 8 specific factors which he labeled primary mental abilities, and they included visual and spatial abilities, perceptual speed, numerical ability, verbal meaning, memory, word fluency, deductive reasoning, and inductive reasoning. Now, Thurstone believed that a single IQ score obscured more than it revealed. They suggested that a profile showing relative strength and weaknesses on the 8 primary abilities would be much more accurate picture of a person's mental ability. Much later, a theory of multiple intelligence emerged. Howard Gardner proposed that intelligence is composed of different kinds of intelligence. He proposed that each intelligence has its own neurological base in a different area of the brain. Gardner believes that there are 8 independent and equally important types of intelligence, or frames of mind. These intelligences include linguistic, logical mathematic, bodily kinesthetic, musical, spatial relations, and 2 kinds of personal intelligence. One is interpersonal and the other is intrapersonal. Then there's naturalist and existential. Now, critics of Gardner's view wonder if special talents really are intelligence or special talents. It's still being debated. The triarchic. Okay. The triarchic theory of intelligence, this is Robert Sternberg's, proposed that intelligence falls into 3 types. The first being analytical, second being creative, and the third being practical. So we'll look at these. The analytical intelligence, otherwise sort of known as book smart, is what we generally think of as academic ability. The second one, creative intelligence, creativity and insights, is basically the ability to cope with novel situations and to profit from experience. The third, practical intelligence, is the street smart. It enables people to adapt to the demands of their environment. So that was a quick review, and that's been part 1. In part 2, we're going to continue with more on the intelligent with specifics about measurement of intelligence. And then we'll look at the influence of intelligence, and we'll finish with language. So that is the end of part 1, and we'll see you in part 2. Bye now.